Preparing to live stream.
Okay.
Okay, we're good.
We're good?
Yep.
Okay. Good evening, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for coming tonight. Tonight, we're going to begin our class on what I said at Mass was going to be a class on the Mass, but not on the theology of the Mass necessarily. I mean, it is somewhat theological, but not on all the theology of the Mass, but on talking about some of the actions that we do at Mass and even some of the prayers that we say and uh, and some of the symbols that we use at Mass as well. I thought that it would be a more interesting topic, say, than talking about the theology of the Mass for people. That way, I think it gives, because people are asking me all the time, why do we do this at Mass, Father? What does this symbol mean at Mass, Father? And it won't just be things at Mass. It'll also be symbols we use maybe in all of our sacraments, symbols we use even outside of the Mass, say at funerals or such other things. And um, and so, but I want to. So tonight, what I want to do is give a little bit of a biblical background to some of the why it is that we use symbols and signs and what the what their biblical roots are to some of them. I'm going to talk a little bit about the sign of the cross as well, since that is the first symbol, first sign that we use, or as the church calls it, first sacramental that we use. As even as children, we learn to use that very young, and um, and so. But before I do that, I'm going to, like I said, I'm going to go into some of the biblical roots of signs and symbols. Now, I thought the appropriate place to start would be at the beginning. So I'm going to begin in the book of Genesis from chapter 1, verses 24 to 31. This is the story, one of the stories of creation. It's the first story of creation. And it's the story on the sixth day of what God does on the sixth day. He, it says, Then God said, Let the earth bring forth every kind of living creature, tame animals, crawling things, and every kind of wild animal. And so it happened. God made every kind of wild animal, every kind of tame animal, and every kind of thing that crawls on the ground. God saw that it was good. Then God said, Let us make human beings in our own image, after our own likeness. Let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, the birds of the air, the tame animals, all the wild animals, and all the creatures that crawl on the earth. God created humankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. God blessed them, and God said to them, Be fertile and multiply. Fill the earth and subdue it. Have dominion over the fish of the sea, the birds of the air, and all the living things that crawl on the earth. But God also said, See, I give you every seed bearing plant on all the earth, and every tree that has seed bearing fruit on it, to be your food. And to all the wild animals, all the birds of the air, and all the living creatures that crawl on the earth, I give all the green plants for food. And so it happened. God looked at everything he had made and found it very good. Evening came and morning followed, the sixth day. Now, as I said, that's the first story of creation in the Bible. There are two there, but this is the one we're going to just use tonight. And um, and the reason I read it to you is because from the beginning, God used signs to show his blessing. So one of the aspects of of a blessing is to show, of a sign is to show God's presence or his blessing. And and so he used sign. What sign does he use in creation? He uses the animals of the world. He uses all the, I mean, if we read the whole story of creation there, he uses the whole earth, the water. He uses the plants of the air, of the earth. He uses the earth we walk on, the water we swim in, the water we drink, the water we wash with. And all of these things are signs of God's love for us. They're a symbol of God's presence in the world to us. It's and it's interesting because you can see this even this story of creation that we read, that I read to you here. This whole story of creation was not original to the Jewish people. This story was co-opted by them from the Babylonians and probably even from people older than that too. And because it but they took it over and they put it in their own context. So this people before them didn't know Yahweh. They didn't know the God of Israel, yet they understood that there was God, that God was. They understood that there was a being or someone or some or many ones up in the heavens blessing them, giving them signs of favor in this world. And they saw that not through the book of a book like the Bible, but they saw that through creation. So the first of all symbols and signs is creation. And it's the first, even the church will tell you in their teaching that the first revelation comes to us from God is in nature, is in God's natural creation. And so um, signs and symbols are as old as creation, you might say, as old as the beginning of human beings. And they're looking at the earth and seeing it as a blessing. So um, then we move to Genesis chapter 4. Now, remember the story of Genesis. You have Adam and Eve in the garden. And then after Adam and Eve are in the garden, they sin, and then they get thrown out of the garden. After out of the garden, they conceive, and they bear a son, Cain, and then they conceive again and bear another son, Abel. And Cain and Abel um, struggle. Cain is the one who feeds on red meat, we're told, and Abel is the one who feeds on mostly vegetables. He's a farmer. He's more sedentary, and Cain is the hunter gatherer, and then they come in conflict with each other because the sacrifice, we're told, the sacrifice that Abel offered is accepted, where the sacrifice that Cain offered is not accepted. It doesn't seem to be as accepted, and Cain gets jealous, and Cain slaughters his brother Abel. And so he is then, God, of course, knows that he did that. And God, I'll read this passage to you then. Genesis 4, 10 to 16. God is is going to punish him. He's going to send him out away from his family. He's going to ban him from his people. And but Cain protests and he says, "What am I? He says, God then said, "What have you done, Cain? Your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground. Now you are banned from the ground that opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. If you till the ground, it shall no longer give you its produce. You shall become a constant wanderer on the earth." Cain said to the Lord, "My punishment is too great to bear. Look, you have now banished me from the ground. I must avoid you and be a constant wanderer on the earth. Anyone may kill me at sight." "Not so," the Lord said to him. If anyone kills Cain, Cain shall be avenged 7 times. So the Lord put a mark on Cain so that no one would kill him at sight. Cain then left the Lord's presence and settled in the land of Nod, east of Eden. So, so Cain, as I said, he slaughters his brother, and he's punished for that. He's banished to wander the earth as a nomad, and um, and he's worried about his survival at that point, of course. But and God decides that He doesn't want anyone to murder Cain. He doesn't want anyone to commit the sin to Cain, that same sin that Cain had committed on his brother Abel. He doesn't want anyone to have to do that. So he, we're told, puts a mark on Cain. We're not told what that mark is. And and from the Hebrew word or the Greek word, it could be any. It doesn't have to be a mark that can be seen. It can be just a sign or symbol. Cain could go up to somebody and make a sign to them that he's untouchable, so to speak, and they would supposedly would understand that. And or it could be he had a birthmark or something like that. Who knows what it really was? And that's not really the point. The point is that God gives him this escape from the curse, you might say, which, when you think about it, what is an escape from a curse? It's a blessing. It's a blessing. Cain will live out the rest of his life, even though it's going to be a difficult life as a wanderer, but at least he doesn't have to worry about being murdered. So, as I said, the Hebrew word for mark could mean a sign, could mean an omen, a warning, or a remembrance. And the mark of Cain is God's promise to offer Cain divine protection from premature death, with the stated purpose of preventing anyone from killing him. It is not known what the mark was, but it is assumed that the mark was visible. Some have speculated that the mark was a Hebrew or a Sumerian letter placed on either the face or the arm, maybe like a tattoo or something. The Septuagint translates the mark as a sign. Thus, it is speculated that the mark served as a sign to others not to commit the same offense. So Cain could even be the sign. He could be the mark, so to speak, for the human race. And it was so the mark of Cain was God's protection. The mark of Cain was God's mercy shining on him. And now we move to a little later in Genesis where Abraham comes into the story. And Abraham, of course, has come along after many, several different generations from Adam, and he's a wanderer like Cain was, but he's not from that same family, but or family line, but he's in the wilderness wandering through the Middle East there, and he's worried about what's going to happen to him and what's going to happen to his to the property that he's amassed and who's going to inherit. And this is in in Genesis chapter 15, verses 8 to 18. Now, this is where God begins making the promises to Abraham that become the Abrahamic covenant, as it's called. So, Lord God, he asked, how will I know that I will possess it? He answered him, Bring me a 3-year-old heifer, a 3-year-old female goat, a 3-year-old turtle dove, a ram, and a turtle dove, and a young pigeon. Abraham brought all these things, split them in two, and placed each half opposite the other. But the birds he did not cut up. Birds of prey swooped down on the carcasses, but Abraham scared them away. As the sun was about to set, a deep sleep fell upon Abram, and a great dark dread descended upon him. Then the Lord said to Abram, know for certain that your descendants will reside as aliens in a land not their own, where they shall be enslaved and oppressed for 400 years. But I will bring judgment on the nations they must serve. And after this, they will go out with great wealth. You, however, will go to your ancestors in peace. You will be buried at a ripe old age. In the 4th generation, your descendants will return here, for the wickedness of the Amorites is not yet complete. When the sun had set and it was dark, there appeared a smoking firepot and a flaming torch, which passed between those pieces. On that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, to your descendants I give this land, from the Wadi of Egypt to the great river, the Euphrates, the land of the Kenites, the Kenizzites, the Cadmonites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Rephaim, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Girgashites, and the Jebusites. So here in this, in the first section of that reading, before I actually read there, Abraham is promised a son by God. And in the second section, he's promised a land. That's a little bit before we got here, but then that's included in here. So there's a covenant promise made by God there. The promise is that Abram will have a child, that he will have an heir, and that heir will inherit a land, his own land, but they'll take it over from somebody else. So he's making the promise of the land. And in order to see, back in the time of Abram, when they made a covenant, when two human beings made a covenant, what they did was they would slaughter an animal or two, and then both parties would walk in between the two animals, the two halves of the animals, like God did in this reading here from Genesis. And he says that, where is it? When the sun had set and it was dark, there appeared a smoking firepot and a flaming torch, which passed between those pieces. That was like the signature on the contract. And God was promising in these things to Abram. And he's making this promise known to Abram, and he's sealing it, so to speak. So a sign is something that not only confers a blessing, but it also confers a guarantee, you might say, or can confer a guarantee or a covenant promise, a contract. And so that's where these signs are, where the sign is, part of the meaning of the sign and from the Old Testament as well. So it's signs and symbols were used for many different purposes. And so it was as I said, cutting up animals was a well-attested way of making a treaty in antiquity. This right is a form of self-imprecation in which violators invoke the same fate as the animals that they march in between, and they invoke it upon themselves. The 8th century BC Sapphire Treaty from Syria reads, as this calf is cut up, Thus Matael shall be cut up. The smoking firepot and the flaming torch, which represent God, pass between the pieces, making God a signatory to that covenant, to that treaty. So in that part, you get again God blessing Abram with a new land, God blessing Abram with a son, or making the promise of these things, and then signing that covenant, so to speak, with his own um, person walking through these slaughtered animals. Abram provided the animals. That's all. Abram now, and a little later in 17, God asked Abram to give his to make his sacrifice in this, or his sign the covenant with his own blood too, and that is called circumcision. So the circumcision is the sign of the covenant, the sign of Abraham's covenant, and this is why all Jews are called to be circumcised, because of this covenant promise that Abram was made between God and Abram. This covenant promise of a land, of a people, okay, that they would be a people, that they would be God's people, his own chosen people, and that they were meant, as we know, as we believe as Christians, and I think they believe too as Jews, that they were called to then become that light to the world, that would proclaim God to the world and enable the world to come to know God better and come to serve Him and love Him too, and then to follow into Judaism. Circumcised. So circumcision was widely practiced in the ancient world. It wasn't only a Jewish ritual, but it was usually done as a rite of initiation, of a rite of passage. So males at puberty were circumcised usually. But with this covenant, the circumcision is taken and moved to infancy. So the male Jewish child is chosen not as an adult, but as a child. And it's a sign of that there's dignity even in the infancy. There's dignity in this person, so that this sign becomes a conference of dignity upon this new person, upon this what do you call it? Upon this infant who's about to become a member of the Jewish people, so to speak, or become a member of the chosen people by being circumcised. So circumcision was widely practiced in the ancient world, usually as initiation rite for males at puberty. By shifting the time of circumcision to the 8th day after birth, biblical religion made it no longer a rite of passage, but the sign of the eternal covenant between God and the community descending from Abraham. So this is the passage 17, Genesis 17, 3-7. Abram fell face down, and God said to him, "For my part, here is my covenant with you. You are to become the father of a multitude of nations. No longer will you be called Abram. Your name will be called Abraham, for I am making you the father of a multitude of nations. I will make you exceedingly fertile. I will make nations of you. Kings will stem from you. I will maintain my covenant between me and you and your descendants after you throughout the ages as an everlasting covenant to be your God and the God of your descendants after you." And 17:11-13, circumcise the flesh of your foreskin. That will be the sign of the covenant between me and you. Throughout the ages, every male among you when he is 8 years old, shall be circumcised, including house-born slaves, and those acquired with money from any foreigner who is not of your descendants. Yes, both the house-born slaves and those acquired with money must be circumcised. Thus my covenant will be in your flesh as an everlasting covenant. So again, this sign is conferring this membership, not solely on Abraham's blood, but anybody within his household. So a slave that he purchased from someone, a male slave that he purchased from someone would have to be circumcised and have to be identified as one of his descendants, one of the chosen people, would have to become, so to speak, a sign of that covenant to the world, and a sign that the Jews are the chosen people, and that God favors them and will grant them their land and grant them many descendants. So it's so when God speaks about many descendants, he isn't necessarily talking about uh, um, what do you call it? Having children, so to speak, blood children, but also having developing a relationship with people and developing a community, a strong community sense, and this and in this way, the sign of the covenant then becomes a sign for all people. Okay, um, and again, it also confers dignity upon the slave who comes into the household, confers dignity upon the infant born into the family, um, which in those days, those were not dignified positions. A child was, because of the infant mortality rate so high, having a child was, emotionally, you didn't attach to a child until they were much older because the chances of their survival was much less than it is today. And so they I mean they took care of the child, but it's wasn't viewed as a real member of the family until it was maybe about puberty. And so this confers a separate kind of dignity in the Jewish realm than was necessarily true to the other cultures around them. And now we move from the Abrahamic covenant now to the covenant between God and Moses. Now this covenant, of course, is um, sealed by the covenant by the gift of the law. God gives the law to the people of Israel. Um, but God gives many signs and wonders. Performs many signs and wonders before the gift of the law. He, in trying to get Pharaoh to to allow the people of Israel to leave, he commits, performs many miracles through Moses for Pharaoh and for the people of Egypt. And the Egyptian people, and especially Pharaoh, were told, remain obstinate despite it all. They see all these miracles, they see all these wonders. Um, some of them, their magicians can reenact, and so they dismiss them. Others of them they can't, but they still dismiss them. And for some reason, Pharaoh grows more and more obstinate each time that Moses comes back to him with a new request to allow his people to leave. And and we're told that God made Pharaoh obstinate, but I don't know. About that, but I don't know why it says that. I haven't figured that one out theologically or logically either. But but the so after the um, last plague of before the last plague, God then speaks to Moses and says that he's going to cause one more plague on the people of Israel, of Egypt. It's going to cause them to lose their firstborn sons. It's going to be all of the firstborn sons, including um, firstborn sons of animals. So any firstborn of an animal, human, is going to die. And the only way to protect yourself from this is by putting the mark of the lamb's blood on the lintels of your door. So the Jewish people are told to make this mark in lamb's blood that they slaughter the Passover lamb, of course, and and to make it on their lintels, and they will protect their firstborn son, but not to go out, not to go out into the evening, not to leave the doors open or anything, just to protect themselves and then to wait. And and they're also told that when they do this, that after that night, that what's going to happen is the Egyptians are going to throw them out, and and he tells them to ask the Egyptian people for gold and money and so forth, and riches and livestock, and he said the Egyptians will give it to you to get rid of you, and so he tells them, of course, that to slaughter the lamb, how to slaughter the lamb, how to cook the lamb, and then he tells them how to eat it even, but he tells them what to do with the blood. He says, but but for you, the blood will mark the houses where you are. Seeing the blood, I will pass over you. I will pass over you. Thereby, when I strike the land of Egypt, no destructive blow will come upon you. So it's a sign that not only confers a blessing, but it also confers protection. Okay. So signs can give blessing, they can give like the mark of Cain, and this mark of the Passover, it's a mark of protection. So it gives us protection, it gives us blessing, it avoids a curse, and so forth. And so these are some of the biblical roots of it. And then they're told what to explain to their children about this rite. It says, when your children ask you, what does this rite of yours mean? You will reply, it is the Passover sacrifice for the Lord, who passed over the houses of the Israelites in Egypt when he struck down the Egyptians and he delivered our houses. When your children ask you, what does this rite mean? You will reply, oh, I already said that. So again, this sense of protection is there, but it's also meant sense that it's meant to be passed on. It's not meant to be kept like this is just my sign. And creation is not just for me, but it's a sign given to the world. And circumcision was not meant just for Abraham and his family, but it was meant to be given to all the members of his household. And then from that household that grew and went out, then it grew into many households. And so it was meant to spread to the world. And as the Passover rite is meant to protect not just the Jews, but all all men and women of good, not just the Jews in Egypt, but the Jews throughout history. They're supposed to celebrate this every year and remember this event every year and remember what God has done for them, to tell the marvels of the Exodus, to tell the stories of the leaving Egypt and of the parting of the Red Sea, crossing into the desert, and being to tell the story of the covenant that was made between God and Abram, to tell the story of the entrance into the promised land, and these are all things that, of course, are very need to be shared. That they can't just be held into for me. God doesn't give a blessing to one person. He gives a blessing to many people. He gives a blessing to all people in a sense. So the Jewish people were meant to be a blessing to the whole world. not to be just a chosen people who blocked everybody else up, but a blessing to the whole world. And and in the same way, the Passover is telling them that too, that they're meant to be a blessing to the whole world. Um, but the other thing the Passover ritual tells them is that, even the covenant with Abram, while saying that, and the mark of Cain, while saying that these are all blessings, it doesn't mean that they're just, there's no downside to it. Look at even creation. Creation has its ups and its downs. The water is wonderful, rain is beautiful, it's wonderful, but it also can cause floods. Um, Summer, sun is beautiful, it's wonderful, but it also can cause droughts. And animals and beasts and wild animals and so forth, they can be wonderful and beautiful, but they can eat away at the food supply that we have. And so there's struggle in all of this too. Cain went out into the world, and just because he was protected by by God doesn't mean that his life was easy. He had to wander the world. He had no home. He had to wander the earth, and he had no place to rest and no place to call his own. And so he was suffering at the same time, even though he was blessed. And Abram, you figure he's told that in that covenant promise, he's told that there's going to be a period of time of 400 years before these covenants begin to be fulfilled. And he's in a sense it's foretelling the story of the time in Egypt and the gift of the law, and then it's telling also a little later it tells the story of, or predicts the future of the Babylonian exile too. And um, and so it's not meant, blessing is not just one sided, and it doesn't mean that there's no more suffering, no more pain, no more loss, but it means that even in that we're still blessed by God, and that we have these signs to protect us as we go through those things, and we have these blessings to protect us as we go through those things. Um, but we don't, you know, people ask me all the time, why is evil allowed in the world? And I mean, I don't know the answer to that question. One one simple answer to it though is that God didn't want us to be robots. He wanted us to choose to love God. So he had to give us legitimate choices. He couldn't just give us the choice, of, well, you can choose me, and everything's going to be, copacetic, or you can choose the bad guy, you can choose the devil, and everything's going to be hell. Couldn't just say that. Couldn't just do that because it wouldn't really, if there was no fun on the bad side, nobody would choose it. But there's some people know some fun on, even when they're doing evil. They enjoy it to a certain extent. Um, so there's a real legitimate choice to be made between good and evil, between God and the devil, between God and evil, and so God wants us to make that choice, but He gave us a legitimate one, and He knows that to choose that is a difficult one. So He blesses us as we make it, gives us His promise, His covenant, that He will be with us through it all. So all of these blessings are signs of the covenant too. They're signs of God's presence. They're signs of His desire to be with us, and His desire for us to be with Him too, to choose Him. Um, Now, there's another symbol, okay, where the sign of the cross, I guess you might say, begins in Judaism, and because the in Ezekiel chapter 9, I'm not going to cite actual um, verse because I don't know which one it is exactly. But in Ezekiel chapter 9, there's a story that Ezekiel talks about where well, here it is. I'll read it to you, but I don't know what the verse is. Then the glory of the God of Israel moved off the cherubim and went up to the threshold of the temple. He called to the man dressed in linen with the scribe's case at his waist. And the Lord said to him, pass through the city, through the midst of Jerusalem, and mark an X on the foreheads of those who grieve and lament over all the abominations practiced within it. Now, Ezekiel's writing uh, at the time, I think, let me just double check this. I have my timeline here. In a hectic week, I haven't had much time as I wanted to get this ready. Hopefully next week I'll have a little bit more time. Some of the events of this week that have occurred have taken me away from it. For that, if I ask your pardon. Here we go. Okay. Ezekiel's writing around the time of the exile. Yes, he's writing actually during the exile and right before it and during the exile. So he's writing here to the people, and what he's trying to tell them is that what's going on in Jerusalem is there's because at that time the kings of Israel were worshiping strange gods. They weren't worshiping God, and they even had used the temple to worship these strange gods. They had defaced the temple, so to speak, by uh, idolatrizing in it. They had been worshiping the god of Baal, the Babylonian god. They were worshiping some of the Canaanite gods, some of the Canaanite gods in the area. They'd been worshiping many other gods, not just Yahweh, and very little actually of Yahweh. So what Ezekiel's saying to them is that there are some people there who have been faithful to this, and so he's telling them that God, the angel's going to. What he's telling to the people is that he wants those who have been faithful to this message, to the true worship of Yahweh, for those people to make a mark on their forehead. And the mark is the sign of the last letter of the Hebrew um, alphabet. It's called Taw or Tau. I don't know how to say it. And it can be written either as a T, capital T, something like that, something to look like that, or an X. So he's telling them to make this mark on their forehead. Again, it's a sign that I have chosen God. It's a sign that um, will protect me from. This is supposed to be the remnant that will be returned to Jerusalem, that will not go through as much of the difficulty and suffering, but the remnant that is allowed to come back to the land of Jerusalem. This is by marking yourself with on your forehead with this. He's saying that the cherub or in this case, Babylon, will come through and destroy the city, but they'll you will be saved, and you may have to emigrate to Babylonia, but you can come back to the land of Egypt. I mean of Israel, and so it's a mark. As I said, the Hebrew words or the Hebrew letter ta or tau, and it's looks like a cross to us as Christians. It looks like a cross. They wouldn't say it looked like a cross to them because they weren't Jew. They weren't Christian. They didn't even know Christ at that point. Nobody did. And so that Hebrew word signifies, the Hebrew letter then is a mark, and it's also the name of the last letter of the alphabet, a letter which in the old Hebrew script was still written in the elemental form of a cross, at least, and it probably up to the New Testament period as well, and even into that period. So that sort of gets us into the now, what we want to talk about tonight a little bit, the sign of the cross. That's of course, we all, as Christians, we all know that what the cross is. We know that Jesus died on the cross, and but you have to remember this in the time of Jesus, in the time of the disciples, in the time of the early church, the Romans used that as it was a sign of torture. It was a sign of pain and suffering and grief. It was the worst penalty imposed upon anyone to be crucified, and it was and anyone that was crucified was considered a terrible criminal, and even even the Jews who saw fellow Jews crucified had such they thought these people what how terrible they must have been to have done whatever it is they did to be crucified. So it's the sign. The cross is not something that you would think would be a blessing. It certainly wasn't in the early church. It wasn't a sign that people would have thought of as a blessing. And so, I mean, probably the first 100 years or so wasn't really a sign that was used so much between Christians. Even they didn't make the sign of the cross at the beginning of their worship. They they would pray more like the Jews would pray. They would, and many times, as we're told, St. Paul would go to the synagogues first to pray in the synagogues, and then when they got thrown out of the synagogues, then they had to begin to develop their own sense of worship. And so they wouldn't make a sign of a cross in the synagogue. It was an abomination there because it was a sign of torture for one thing, and it was a torture that was used on many Jewish people for another thing, and it was bringing in these ideas of these terrible, horrible criminals into the midst of this prayerful environment, and they thought it was an abomination and it was against God to bring that in. So and remember that Peter, the disciples were all Jews. They wouldn't have they would have thought similarly, even though they had witnessed the crucifixion, even though they had witnessed the resurrection. The cross would have been a difficult image for them to see as a blessing, even then still, I'm sure. So so it wasn't something that began right away as a sign of blessing in the church. It took time for it to evolve and develop. Ooh. Um, but about the second century AD, then it started to become more popular, or so to speak. It may became a better sign. And they started to use it for baptisms because again, St. Paul's theology was that he was the one really that began to develop this sense of uh, quote unquote comfort with the cross when he started talking about the theology of the cross as being, and even a baptism being, sharing in the death of Christ on the cross, and that the cross of Christ was in fact a blessing, not a curse, and that it was through his death that we are saved, and so it became the symbol of God's blessing in the world, his ever present blessing in the world. And today, as it's grown, it's taken on because it was used in baptism. We as Catholics, we use it in every single one of our rituals. We use it at Mass. We use it at the beginning, at the end. We also use it, Deacon Mike and I, when we read the gospel, where the rubrics are that we have to make the sign of the cross on our forehead, on our lips, and on our heart as we read the gospel to proclaim that message to the world. And I make the sign of the cross over the gifts, where that's part of what I have to do at the Mass. I have to make the sign of the cross there. These are blessings which I perform, and as we get ready to consecrate the bread and the wine, we use it for baptism, of course. I baptize you in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. I then do a prayer of Ephphatha, and I make the sign of the cross on the lips and the ears of the child, and the eyes of the child. Then I make the sign of the cross in chrism on his forehead and on his chest, and I think, I'm not sure, one of the anointings is on the chest, and Mike does more than I do right now, so I'm a little out of touch. But um, it's getting late. One of the things two things I want to do here first. I know that, like I said, people ask me all the time about what does this mean? What does that mean? Why do we do this? Why do we do that? I'm hoping that from now on, for the next 5 weeks, you guys can bring up some things that you might be interested in learning about, what you might like to know more about. And so I know maybe you haven't thought about it so much right now, but if you would either email me, if you want to say it tonight, we can I can get that down and work on it for the next couple of weeks. But so we have 4 more weeks of this. Otherwise, I'll just go through different sections of the Mass. But I know different symbols that we use at our sacraments, and we'll just talk about those that I like to talk about. But otherwise, I'd want you guys to tell me what you want to hear about, what sacraments or symbols, not sacraments, but sacramentals or symbols that you'd like to hear more about, and hear better explained for you. So I turn it over to you right now, or if you have any questions too. I wasn't sure if I have enough. Okay, so like I said, email me, text me. You can drop it in the collection if you want. On if you want to be anonymous about it, you can do it that way too, or you can ask me at Mass. But I can't guarantee that I'll remember if you ask me at Mass, because you can ask Michelle. I sometimes forget things. Okay. Thank you, everybody. I uh, I appreciate you coming tonight, participating, and I hope to hear from you. Take care. God bless you tonight.